Episode 8 continued Political Extremism and Violence in the Weimar Republic between 1919 and 1923. Any and all information covered in this audiobook originated from the 8th chapter of the First Germany booklet. After the German Revolution of 1918 and 1819, the left-wing movement remained in a state of confusion. The moderate socialists of the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, were committed to parliamentary democracy. The communists, the KPD, pressed for a workers' revolution. The independent German Social Democratic Party, USPD, stood for the creation of a radical socialist society, but within a democratic framework. This situation became clearer when, in 1920, the USPD disbanded and the vast majority of its members joined either the KPD or the SPD. Whilst the SPD was initially popular without the workers, they bore the brunt of the economic crises of the 1920s and then suffered even more during the Depression of the 1930s, and so increasingly began to question whether the new state really belonged to them. It was the consistent policy of the KPD to oppose the Republic. The KPD wanted a Marxist revolution, the creation of a one-party state, and the restructuring of Germany both socially and economically, specifically along the lines of the 1917 Russian Revolution. They believed that the SPD had betrayed the cause of social revolution, and consequently they never forgave the SPD for their use of the Freikorps when they crushed the Spartacists and other left-wing groups. The differences between the moderate and extreme left were so fundamental that there was no chance of political cooperation between them, let alone them coming together to form one socialist movement. From 1920, the KPD contested Reichstag elections and scorned the parliamentary system, using it only as a propaganda platform in a foolhardy attempt to expose what they considered to be the futility of parliamentary action. They believe that the proletarian class would not achieve social justice until it lost faith in the Reichstag's strategy. This would then lead to an insurrection, one determined to seize power. Alas, the obstructive policies of the communists in the Reichstag would play a key role in paralyzing political life in the Reichstag from 1930 to 1930 to 1933, thus creating the situation which would enable Hitler to come to power. Between the years 1919 and 1923, the KPD was a reasonable political force. It enjoyed the support of 10 to 15% of the electorate, and there were continuous revolutionary disturbances, protests, strikes, and uprisings. After the Spartacist revolt was crushed by the German army and Thermidors, the two most significant disturbances were the Red Bavaria and the German October. There were also significant disturbances in the Ruhr in March 1920, crushed by the German army and Freikorps, and in Saxony and Hamburg in 1923, crushed by police, the Red Bavaria. After the collapse of the Bavarian monarchy, the USPD leader, Kurt Eisner, took the political lead. However, he struggled to unite the socialist parties and wasn't able to implement reforms. He was assassinated on the 21st of February 1919. Confusion then broke out. A Bavarian Soviet Republic with a Red Army of workers was set up by Eugen Levine and proposed radical political and economic changes. Yet, after a month, the Freikorps and the army moved in and brutally crushed the Republic. The month of May also saw 1,000 deaths. This often seen as the beginning of the White Terror. This traumatic episode in a conservative agricultural Catholic area shifted politics to the right wing, and it consequently became a haven for extremists. The German October. Amongst the crisis of 1923, left-wing revolutionary actions came to a head in central Germany. The KPD and SPD had formed coalitions in the regional governments of Saxony and Thuringia, but the communists went further and made military preparations for an uprising with proletarian hundreds, otherwise known as defense units. In response, Stresemann's government acted rapidly to foil the plan for the German October Revolution. The army crushed the units, and the regional governments were recreated without communists. This leaves us with the question, how big a threat did the extreme left pose? Right-wing propaganda, combined with the dramatic nature of some of the events outlined above, led many Germans to have exaggerated fears about the possibility of an impending Bolshevik-inspired revolution. However, looking back, it is clear that the extreme left posed much less of a threat to Weimar than was believed at the time. The combination of their own weakness and the effective resistance of the Weimar government meant the left was never really likely to seize political power. Even during the chaos and uncertainty of the extreme left proved incapable of mounting a unified attack on Weimar democracy. The Free Corps had removed some of the left's ablest and most spirited leaders, such as Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and the later leadership suffered from internal divisions and disagreements on tactics, and repression continued to be brutal throughout the period. However, the Weimar government also played on the differences within the extreme left by making concessions which split it. Threats from right in detail. There weren't just threats from the left wing of the political spectrum. The right wing was powerful too and often had the force of the Army Officer Corps behind them. Many right-wingers and extreme nationalists believed that a parliamentary and democratic government had been foisted on them, partially because of the government's fears of a left-wing communist revolution. They were convinced that it did not properly reflect the views of the German people. The belief that the Versailles settlement proved that the Republican politicians had betrayed German interests to their enemies. In other words, the Allied powers. They had differing aims, however. Some wanted to see a restoration of the monarchy. Others wanted a more military style of authoritarian regime. In areas like Bavaria, there was a strong movement for independence and the restoration of the Bavarian monarchy. Yet other parts of Germany wanted to see closer integration of all areas. These divisions obviously weakened the threats from the right and were part of the reason why the Republic was able to survive. The extreme right appeared in various forms. It included a number of political parties and was also the driving force behind the activities of various paramilitary organizations. However, the extreme right also appealed to a wide range of people. Number 1. Members of the Free Corps. As a result of the demobilization of the armed forces, there were nearly 200 paramilitary units around Germany by 1919. They were employed by the government to suppress the threats from the extreme left, but became a law unto themselves. They were anti-republican and had no respect for the Weimar government. They became key players in the White Terror. Number 2. The Consul Organization. As the government tried to control the actions of the Free Corps, right-wing terrorist gangs emerged, with the most notorious being the Consul Organization. Number 3. The aristocratic elites of the Kaiserreich, such as junkers, landowners, and military chiefs. Number 4. Industrialists and businessmen. They feared the rise of communism and believed that the Republic was too weak to defeat it. Number 5. Fascist nationalism. The effects of the war and its aftermath increased the attraction of racist nationalism. By the early 1920s, there were probably around 70 relatively small splinter nationalist parties, which were also racist and anti-Semitic, one example being the Nazi Party. Bavaria became a haven for these groups because the regional state government was extremely reactionary. The Kapp Putsch, March 1920. Background to the Putsch. By January 1920, the government was obliged to put into effect the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. President Ebert tasked the defense minister, Gustav Noske, with reducing the size of the army and disbanding some Free Corps units. In February 1920, Noske, a social democrat who had previously used the Free Corps to put down communist and left-wing uprisings, ordered 2 Free Corps units to disband. These units, totaling 12,000 men, were stationed only 12 miles from Berlin and were led by General Luttwitz, a battle-hardened commander involved in crushing the Spartacist uprising and a vehemently outspoken opponent of the Treaty of Versailles. After refusing the order, resulting in the government issuing his arrest warrant, Luttwitz marched his troops to Berlin in protest, gaining the support of many sympathetic army officers and civil servants. Luttwitz was also supported by Wolfgang Kapp, an anti-Versailles politician and member of the DNVP who was intent on organizing a putsch. The response. Ebert and his chancellor, Gustav Bauer, called on the regular army to crush the rising. However, the chief of the army, General Siecht, refused. He famously told Ebert troops, "Do not fire on troops. When Reichswehr fire on troops, when Reichswehr fires on Reichswehr, all comradeship within the officer corps has vanished." On the 13th of March, Ebert and his government were forced to flee to Dresden, while Kapp declared himself the Chancellor in Berlin. Crucially, however, Generals Siecht and Ludendorff, while deeply unsympathetic to democracy, were also keen to preserve the interests of the army and, as such, remained non-committal. Failure of the putsch. The situation appeared dangerous, but there was actually considerable tension between military and the civilian elements of the putsch, and it failed to gain widespread support, even from the right wing. Civil servants and bankers remained lukewarm and often hostile, while trade unions, encouraged by socialist members of Ebert's government, called a general strike. The ordinary workers, some of whom supported the government but most of whom simply wanted to protect their city from a right-wing insurrection, brought Berlin to a standstill, and within 4 days the putsch collapsed. Kapp and Luttwitz were forced to flee, and Ebert and his government returned, but not quite to the air of triumph that might have been expected. Lessons from the putsch. The putsch taught a number of lessons. The army was not to be trusted, yet without it the Weimar Republic was very weak. The workers' groups had showed their power. However, this was not necessarily in support of the government, a realization that renewed vigor to the communists. Furthermore, civil servants had proved they could be disloyal, and the lenience shown by right-wing judges towards those brought to trial in the aftermath of the putsch contrasted strongly with harsh treatment of those on the left wing. This behavior sent a message that the government was not really in control. The White Terror, 1921 to 23. Nationalist agitation continued for years after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and this was shown in a number of high-profile assassinations during a period that came to be known as the White Terror. In case you were not aware, white is synonyms with conservative and nationalist ways of thinking, as opposed to the color red, which is associated with left-wing revolutionaries. While some atrocities were carried out by the left wing, the majority during this period were conducted by the right, in particular the Free Corps. Their attitude at this time is worryingly summed up in an instruction given by a leader to his men. It is a lot better to kill a few innocent people than to let one guilty person escape. Victims of the Terror. Matthias Erzberger, 1875 to 1921, was the leader of the Zentrum finance minister, 1919. On the 26th of August 1921, he was murdered by members of the Organization Council, a group of political activists which largely comprised of young ex-officers who had a reputation for violence. His quote-unquote crime was to have been involved in the armistice negotiations of November 1918. After his death, his grave was regularly abused. Two other early victims were the USPD leaders Kurt Eisner and Hugo Haus, both of whom were assassinated in 1919. Walther Rathenau, 1867 to 1922, who, might I add, was of a Jewish background, had played a crucial role in maintaining war production and helped to counter the devastating effects of the Allied naval blockade. After the war, he joined the DDP and served as Minister for Reconstruction. It was therefore his task to fulfill the economic obligations imposed on Germany in the Versailles settlement. He had strongly held democratic views and was convinced of the need to encourage international cooperation. In 1922, he became Foreign Secretary and was largely responsible for negotiating the Treaty of Rapallo with the Russians, which restored normal relations between the two states. In spite of these achievements, Rathenau was not popular with right-wing nationalists who accused him of creeping communism. Always a likely target for assassins, he refused to take any precautions to ensure his safety. On the 24th of June 1922, he was gunned down as he drove to his office in an open car. So shocked were many Germans by this outrage that the following day 70,000 protesters lined the streets of Berlin. Foreign powers were also appalled, and the value of the mark fell even further. The impact altogether between 1919 and 1923, there were 376 assassinations, 22 of which were carried out by the left and 354 by the right. The Republic finally acted in July 1922 when it passed a law for the protection of the Republic. This imposed severe penalties on those involved in conspiracy to murder and banned extremist organizations like Organization Consul. However, the law was limited as many judges were themselves sympathetic to the views of the right and consequently failed to impose just punishments on those found guilty. In fact, the staunchly conservative and nationalist government in Bavaria refused to implement the law at all, thus enabling Hitler and the Nazis to get away with murder in 1923. The 1923 Munich Beer Hall Putsch. The first time that Hitler entered the political scene was in 1923, as he helped to lead, though he was not the only important person, a revolt in Munich. However, before we address the Beer Hall Putsch, we need to understand how strong the right was. Gustav Stresemann became Chancellor of Germany in August 1923 as the leader of a coalition ranging from the SPD to the moderate conservative DVP. By November, his government was having some success in tackling the economic crisis. The new currency was restoring stability to the economy and passive resistance to the French occupation of the Ruhr, which had only worsened the economic situation, had been called off. However, Stresemann still faced major political problems. The Bavarian state government opposed his decision to call off passive resistance and regarded the national government as too weak to withstand threats from the left. Bavaria had been one of the most turbulent areas in Germany since 1918. It had experienced both a brief Soviet republic and a right-wing regime opposed to Weimar democracy. Traditionally, Bavaria was hostile to Prussia, had its own cultural traditions, and acted independently, having kept its own monarch during the Second Reich. In September 1925, right-wing politicians in Bavaria, backed by the Bavarian Reichswehr commander Otto von Lossow, considered marching on Berlin to replace the central government. Only the Weimar government's action in driving communists from the Saxon and Thuringian governments finally dissuaded the Bavarian government from challenging Berlin. However, this was not the end of the threat from the right. In November 1925, the little-known Nazi Party tried to seize power in Munich, an attempt which is the main focus of this subsection. The crisis facing the Weimar regime in autumn 1923, the economic crisis, the French occupation of the Ruhr, and the German government's policy of passive resistance was causing hyperinflation. The threat from the left. Communists had joined socialists in the state governments of Saxony and Thuringia. There was talk of a German October. The threat from the right. The army. Many conservatives still looked to the army to replace the democratic system. Bavaria. The right-wing government of Bavaria was defying the federal government in Berlin. The army in Bavaria had sworn loyalty to Gustav von Kahr, not the Reich government. The Bavarian leaders were worried by communists in neighboring states. There was talk of the Bavarian government trying to overthrow the federal government. The Nazis, Hitler's Nazis, and other right-wing Bavarian groups were also considering trying to seize power. Stresemann's actions. Action. He bravely called off passive resistance since it had failed to force a French withdrawal. Result. This infuriated the right, who saw Stresemann's action as giving in to the French. There was more talk of a right-wing putsch. Action. He sent the army into Saxony and Thuringia and overthrew the left-wing governments. But he did nothing about the right-wing government in Bavaria, which was defying his authority. Result. This upset the SPD, who left the coalition government in protest. It pleased the Bavarian government, which now lost enthusiasm for a putsch. Key individuals. General Erich von Ludendorff, popular hero from the First World War, had virtually run the government from 1916 to 1918. He was a determined opponent of democracy and had been involved in the Kapp-Putsch. General Hans von Seeckt. Most powerful general, suspicious of democracy, but also concerned about the danger of civil war. Ambiguous attitude, known as the Sphinx. He wanted the army kept above politics. He felt it should obey legitimate government, provided it protected the army's interests. Otto von Lossow, commander of the Reichswehr in Bavaria. He was very conservative and favored a strong national state. Gustav von Kahr, the Bavarian leader, state commissioner. A reactionary monarchist, he considered re-establishing a German emperor or an independent Bavarian kingdom. He was described as muddle-headed. Adolf Hitler, leader of small Nazi movement, 55,000 members, one of many right-wing Bavarian groups. He had a paramilitary force, they say. How did Hitler first try to gain power? On the 8th of November 1923, Otto von Lossow and Gustav von Kahr address a meeting of 2,000 right-wing supporters in a Munich beer hall. Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into the meeting. They declare a national revolution, and gun in hand, Hitler forces Kahr and Lossow into a side room. The two men are forced to state their support for a march on Berlin with the aim of imposing a new government. General Ludendorff is said to be its new commander-in-chief. Whilst this is happening, thousands of stormtroopers seize other members of the Bavarian government. They terrorize their opponents, but they fail to gain control of the army barracks. After Lossow and Kahr promise loyalty to the putsch, Ludendorff allows them to leave the beer hall. On the 9th of November, President Ebert declared a state of emergency because of the treason in Munich. General Seeckt orders Lossow to crush the revolt. Lossow and Kahr issue a proclamation denouncing the putsch. Ludendorff persuades Hitler to march into Munich, who is under the impression that it is the first step on the march to Berlin. Ludendorff is convinced that the soldiers will support their former commander and refrain from firing on him. At noon, 2,000 armed Nazis march to a military base in Munich. They are met by armed police and Bavarian soldiers. A shot is fired, probably by the Nazis, and the police return fire. 14 Nazis are killed, including the person who was stood next to Heike. Most of the Nazis fall to the ground and take cover. Hitler dislocates a shoulder in his fall and proceeds to flee. L. Ludendorff continues to march up to the police, where he is arrested. On the 11th of November, Hitler is arrested, and the Nazis are banned by Seeckt. In February 1924, Hitler, Ludendorff and the leaders are tried for treason, a crime which carries the death penalty. Hitler sees the trial as an opportunity and uses it to attack the Weimar regime and expound his views. Hitler achieves national fame. The trial, which transpires just before the elections, helps the Nazi voice. The Nazis become the third largest group in Bavaria. Not only that, but the judges are also sympathetic to their ideology. Ludendorff is acquitted of all charges, and Hitler is sentenced to 5 years in prison, the minimum possible sentence. The judges accept Ludendorff's explanation that he had only been present by accident, an excuse which he had used successfully in 1920 following his involvement in the Kapp-Putzer. Hitler is kept in good conditions in Landbury prison, where he writes and dictates Mein Kampf. The Nazis nearly disintegrate without their leader. Hitler is released after just 9 months. Why did Hitler's putsch fail? Hitler proved singularly ineffective. Nothing had been properly planned, and when Hitler was forced to recognize that von Lossow and von Kahr had resumed their freedom of action and were taking measures to suppress the rising he moods, anger, despair, apathy, renewed hope, hesitation. He remained shut up, suffered a nervous collapse in which he passed through a whole succession of in the beer hall, isolated from the crowds from which he had always drawn strength, and unable to make up his mind whether or not to risk a demonstration. It was Ludendorff who decided for him, and, at the head of a column, led out Hitler, the other Nazi leaders, and several thousand men into the center of the city. Eyewitness accounts strongly suggest that Hitler had already lost all faith in what they were doing. When a police cordon opened fire, 14 in the procession and 3 policemen were killed and many more wounded. While Ludendorff marched on and pushed through the cordon, Hitler, after being pulled to the ground and dislocating his shoulder, scrambled to his feet and fled. The chances of bringing off a coup in 1923, comparable with Mussolini's march on Rome the year before, had never been more than marginal. A republic without republicans. How unstable was Weimar government? The Weimar Republic has historically been known as a republic without republicans. For example, in the 1920 election, the SPD declined from 37.9% to 21.7%, and the German Democratic Party, DDBP, declined from 18.5% to 8.3%. The Centre Party largely maintained their share. The KPD-SPD increased their share of the votes from 7.3% to 20%. The extreme right DNVP polled 15.1% in the 1920 election. This meant that a sizable proportion of those elected to the Reichstag were actually opponents of democracy. This put a huge burden on the moderate parties such as the SDP, the Centre Party and the DDP to work together to form a stable coalition. However, in times of social, economic and political crisis, society became more polarized and support for more extreme parties, who would not join coalition governments, increased, which meant it became exceptionally challenging to form a government with a Reichstag majority. The SDP could be inflexible due to its Marxist roots. The DDP was in decline. The Centre Party was divided amongst itself on social and economic issues. The DVNP generally refused to join any coalitions, except the Luther and Marx cabinets, and the KDP did refuse to join any coalition. The Reichstag became quite remote from the concerns of ordinary voters because deputies in the Reichstag did not represent a particular constituency, and deputies were effectively controlled by party committees. Factional rivalries also weakened many parties, so that there was little long-term thinking in the wider national interest. In the 4 years between 1919 and 1923, the Weimar had 6 governments, the longest of which lasted just 18 months. During this period, the conservative forces successfully exploited the image of the left as a powerful threat, and this contributed to the tendency of Weimar governments to underestimate the extent of opposition to the regime from the extreme right. Although the violent forces of counter-revolution were too weak and disorganized to seize power, the power and influence of the extreme right was nonetheless a serious threat to Weimar democracy. Further detail on Weimar politics. In October 1919, Prince Max of Baden became the new Chancellor as part of the October reforms, which were a major constitutional transformation. Prince Max was responsible to the Reichstag, and his government, which was formed based on the majority parties in the Reichstag, had control of the armed forces. Prince Max resigned on 9th November and handed the position to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the SDP. The Kaiser's formal abdication on 10th November made Ebert the first Chancellor of the new German Republic. On 19th January 1919, elections for the Constituent Assembly were held. Ebert became the first president of the Republic. Philipp Schiedemann, SDP, became Chancellor, forming a government in coalition with the Centre and German Democratic parties. Gustav Bauer, SDP, a former trade union official and the Minister of Labour for Ebert and Schiedemann, succeeded Schiedemann as Chancellor in June 1919. However, he was forced to resign in March 1920 after the Kapp Putsch. He was replaced by Hermann Müller, SDP, who lasted until an unsuccessful election in June 1920. The coalition formed in June 1920, led by Konstantin Fehrenbach, was dominated by the Centre Party and supported by many powerful German industrialists. His cabinet was the first in the new republic that did not include the SDP. Fehrenbach's cabinet resigned in protest at the harsh terms of the Reparation Commission's report in May 1921. Joseph Wirth, a former teacher, became the new Chancellor. Alongside Rathagno, he was responsible for the Rapallo Pact. Wirth believed the biggest threat came from the right, but he failed to bring all the democratic parties together in coalition. Wilhelm Kuno, who replaced him, formed a government mostly composed of non-party economists and members of centrist parties. It was not a government formed as a result of an explicit coalition between the parliamentary parties, but it was hoped that Kuno's business expertise would help him to steer Germany through difficult times. Kuno's government resigned as a result of a vote of no confidence initiated by the SDP in the wake of the Ruhr crisis. He was replaced by Gustav Stresemann as Chancellor in August 1923. Although Stresemann was replaced as Chancellor by Wilhelm Marx in November 1923, after the SDP left his coalition, he remained as Minister for Foreign Affairs until October 1929. Wilhelm Marx remained as Chancellor until January 1925, and this stability, Stresemann's success as Foreign Minister and the success of Schacht Reich Currency Commissioner and head of the Reichsbank in stabilizing the economy, provides the backdrop for the WEIMAR Golden Years. Both elections of 1924 indicated a return of greater support for the parties that supported the Weimar Republic, specifically the SDP, DDP, and Centre. 67% of the electorate voted for pro-Republican parties by December 1924, and the Nazi share of the vote was down to 3%. Moreover, by 1928, it was down to 2.6%. All the coalitions from 1923 until the Grand Coalition of June 1928 could be described as centre-right. To see more information on the 1919 and 1920 Reichstag elections, specifically its results and the foregone and forthcoming coalitions, please consult pages 66 and 66 and 67 of the aforementioned Germany booklet.